Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to today's webinar, jointly hosted by Giant and Osborne Clarke. I'm just going to wait a couple of minutes, or just a minute or so, just to make sure we allow everyone to jump in and join today's session. Be really nice whilst we're waiting if you guys want to jump into the chat on the webinar ribbon and say hello to each other. Let us know where you are. We're aware we've got people joining from across Europe today to hear what the guys have got to say about all things Belgium and Netherlands. So please do feel free to jump on chat and introduce yourself, and we'll kick off the session in 20-30 seconds time. Okay, we've still got a few people coming in, so I'll just wait another 10-15 seconds and then I think we'll get started. Okay, so it looks like it's slowing down now, so I think we'll kick off. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this webinar with myself, Dan Haslam, where we're looking at focusing on compliance and legal considerations that businesses should be aware of when they're looking at working with workers both in the Netherlands and Belgium. Over the next sort of 45 minutes or so, we'll be discussing considerations for businesses who are looking at engaging temporary workers in those two countries. And I'm really, really pleased to see such a large audience for today's session. I think we've got a mixture of recruitment businesses as well as end hirers from across Europe. So I think it's fair to say it's a hot topic for people, and I think it's reasonable to also say no matter where you operate, whether that's UK or across Europe, I think we're all acutely aware that there's a lot of talent shortages in many countries and industry sectors, and so more and more businesses are looking at hiring temporary workers to address those skill shortages. And so we want to make sure that we explore today some of those legal considerations that businesses should be thinking about when you're looking at hiring workers specifically from Belgium and Netherlands. And where it's relevant, we'll also try and highlight some of the key differences between those territories and also the UK market. There's a few topics that we're looking at covering today. I think one of my big learns from looking at international payroll and worker compliance is first just trying to get consistent language being used and terms. So we're going to try and have some feedback from the guys on a bit of a glossary of words and phrases that are used between countries. I think if we can get some common use of language there and understanding, that'll be a great place to start today's session. We're then going to move on to probably one of the biggest topics and the ones that we get asked most frequently about, around the problematic issue of worker classification. I know it's a thorn in the side for many in many countries, not just the UK with IR35, but certainly topical in Belgium and Netherlands. So Thierry and Jorgo will talk through that with us. We'll also look at a number of ways that workers can be engaged by companies. There's obviously different options available, and what are the pros and cons of each of those operations when engaging with workers. And we'll also look at the various different types of providers who you might be able to work with that can supply those workers. And hopefully that'll give you a good oversight of the options that are available if you're looking at accessing talent in Netherlands and Belgium. We really want to make this session an interactive one, so I'm super keen for questions to be posed. So please do send them in via the Q&A button. We're going to try and leave 10-15 minutes at the end of the sessions where I can pose those questions to the guys. So feel free to punch the questions in as we go. So yeah, without further ado then, let's move straight in to the session brought to you today by Osborne Clarke and Giant Group. Giant, a workforce management business that have been operating now for 30 years, and Osborne Clarke, an international law firm who advise on a range of matters, including employment and tax law involved in the temporary labour market. So I'm delighted to welcome speakers for today, and I'll ask the guys just to briefly introduce themselves. So Jorgo, if I could come to yourself first, and if you could introduce yourself.
Yes, thank you, Danielle. My name is Jorgo Tsiris. I've been an employment partner in the Netherlands for Osborne Clarke for over 10 years now, specializing in workforce solutions and general and collective employment law.
Fantastic, thank you. And would you also like to introduce your colleague Meryl as well today, who I know is also
Yes, so
supporting you
Meryl is
in the
sitting
Netherlands?
next to me. She has got a PhD in the workforce solutions sector, and she's joined OC a few months ago, and she kindly assisted me with the preparation of this webinar, and she will answer some of your questions, Daniel, later on in the webinar.
Fantastic. No, great to have Meryl with us as well. Thank you. Thierry, would you like to say hello?
Yes, hello everyone. I'm Thierry Vierin, the employment partner here in Brussels. I set up the Osborne Clarke firm in Brussels here 10 years ago. At the same time, when Jorgo joined in Amsterdam. And one of the sectors we focus most on is the staffing sector, the recruitment sector. So we work for quite a lot of US and UK staffing businesses.
Fantastic. Thanks, Thierry. And last but not least, Charles.
Yeah, hi everyone. So I'm Charles Dorr. I'm the MD of Giant Global. Joined Giant around 18 months ago now, specifically to set up an international payment division for the group. Giant's obviously got a long history working with the recruitment sector and had been involved with some international operations in the past, but there was a desire to move forward with that, and so I've joined with that remit to get our international payroll up and running.
Fantastic. Thanks for joining, Charles. Okay, and I'm Dan Haslam. I'm Group Sales Director for Giant, and I've got the easy role today. I'll be posing the questions to the guys who can then feed back to us on their answers. A list of set questions that we've set up. But again, just to reinforce, please do hit the Q&A button and push some questions over to us. We'll create some time at the back end of the session to go through audience questions. So I think let's get going and begin first by looking at the terminology that we all sort of use when discussing the temporary labour market. There's often variations, I think, between countries in how we might describe temporary workers. And I think that varies between countries. So I think that can lead sometimes to a little bit of confusion when trying to explain scenarios with overseas clients or colleagues. So let's try and demystify some of that. Jorgo, if we can start with you first, please. It'd be interesting if you could just give us a brief overview of the terminology that you use when discussing the temporary labour market in the Netherlands, please.
Okay, yeah, thank you, Danielle. So terminology indeed in this context is very important. For example, temporary work. If you would use that phrase in the Netherlands, we would immediately interpret that as an employee who would work on an indefinite term employment agreement directly concluded with the company benefiting from the work. So that would mean a dual relationship. In this webinar, we'll talk about the triangle relationships, which makes it a little bit more complex. So for example, we will be discussing temporary agency workers as group number 1, payroll employees, group number 2, and self-employed persons without personnel, which then group number 3. So how would we interpret the phrase temporary agency workers? We would read that as recruited by a temporary work agency, after which they enter into an employment agreement. The temporary work agency provides them to user client companies that are referred to as user companies. The user company has a service agreement with the temporary work agency, on the basis of which the agency will provide the user company with workers to perform work under the supervision of the user company. The user company and the temporary agency worker do not have a contractual relationship with each other. So that's a triangle relationship number 1. The second one here in the Netherlands is the payroll employee. That's an employee of a payrolling agency. Contrary to a temporary work agency, a payrolling agency does not select and recruit the worker. That's done by the user company. The user company would recruit the worker themselves, after which the worker enters into an employment agreement with the payrolling agency to be provided or assigned to the user company to exclusively perform work under the supervision of this user company. So there's a difference between the temporary agency worker and the payroll worker. Thirdly, the self-employed person, that's a worker that has its own business, but without personnel. All work granted to this person is performed by the person himself or herself. Self-employed persons are often referred to as contractors or independent contractors as well. In the Dutch language, they are sometimes referred to as ZZP. User companies might engage with self-employed persons directly, but user companies nowadays often get in touch with the self-employed workers through intermediaries. Intermediaries mediate between the user company and the self-employed person, sometimes just in the process of concluding an agreement between the self-employed person and the user company. But sometimes these intermediaries are also involved during the performance of the agreement. Back to you, Daniel.
Yeah, no, that made sense. I think just picking on the ZZP piece, I think for those from the UK, that's the comparable to what we would call a sole trader in the UK. But I think the concepts that you were going through there, Jorgo, would be all familiar from a UK perspective. So, Thierry, if I could bring you in here, please, it'd be interesting to hear what sort of terms and language you use in Belgium in the same respect.
Yes, in Belgium, it's a bit similar. So we have indeed also the temporary agency workers that are typically called here interim workers. So these people are hired by the temporary agency and then put at disposal. It's one of the forms of putting at disposal that is permitted in Belgium and used by the end user. It's a triangle relationship indeed. We see that more for blue collar workers, and it's strictly regulated in Belgium. So it's mainly when you have a peak of work or people who are absent or sick that need to be replaced typically. We also have the employer of record, EOR or PEO. This is something also where the terminology is important. An EOR typically would be a company that would put people on their payroll and then also put them at disposal of the user. So this is something that flows over from the US, the UK. It's still a bit gray zone in Europe, but in Belgium, typically we have a system to make that work because we have a piece of legislation that makes that employees of the EOR can receive operational instructions from the user. So that would be typically a model that is possible in Belgium. And then we have what we call a contractor / consultant self-employed worker, what you would call the sole trader in the UK. So this is a self-employed worker working on projects. We see them a lot in Belgium, and I will explain why a bit later. We also use the term of manco, which is the sole trader who will have his own company where he will be the sole shareholder and work through that company for tax reasons mainly. So this is a kind of, it's also a self-employed worker, but via his management company, manco. And then we also use the term of consultancy in general, where employees of a company are sent to the end user, which can also be freelancers who are used on projects at the end client. So I think these terminologies are yes, known also in the UK and are very similar, I would say, in the UK.
Yeah, no, I would agree with that at a high level, but it'd be great, Charles, if you could also just come in there and sort of summarise the same references that we use in the UK.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, there are a few different ways that we refer to temporary workers and the way that they're actually paid. But I guess essentially temps, contractors, contingent workers are all essentially the same type of worker. You know, someone who is engaged on as a temporary resource to an end client. And in the UK, temp workers are often actually paid via an umbrella company. And that's so that they are actually employed correctly and compliantly. And so we often get referred to at Giant Global as an international umbrella company, But I guess really what we are is an international contractor management company that engages temporary workers in a range of compliance solutions that the guys have just been kind of going through. We generally look to refer to the solution types as either employer of record or agent of record. EOR, where it's an employed solution, and AOR is then when we're engaging with perhaps a freelancer or a limited company.
Yeah, no, definitely makes sense. I think it's interesting coming from a UK market where umbrella is this term bandied around. In reality, what that is it's an employer of record solution in the UK that happens to have a badge of umbrella, and often employer of record businesses operate with full-time employees as such, as opposed to temporary workers, and perhaps that's where there's a slight variation as well. But I think it's at least reassuring to hear there's some commonality in themes there running across all three countries, which I think is great. So I think that was really useful to understand, and hopefully it's going to help us now when we move on to the next thorny issue of worker classification. So, of course, in the UK, this is a topic that never seems to go away. And over the most recent years, lots of discussions around IR35, but of course, this isn't a new concept, and many other countries have similar legislation in place. So I'm really fascinated to hear from Jorgo and Thierry as to the rules around how workers can be employed and operate in the respective countries. So Jorgo, if we can come and start with yourself, please. Talk us through how you approach worker classification in the Netherlands.
Yes, thank you, Danielle. So in the Netherlands, there is mandatory law which actually deems workers as employees if there is three elements are fulfilled, which is work, salary or wages, and supervision over the work. So these three criteria must be met to come to the conclusion that a certain relationship is an employment agreement. So work, wages, and supervision. Work and wages wouldn't normally be the problem. So it's all about supervision when classifying a worker as either an employee or a self-employed person. The question is always, what about supervision? Because the supervision element distinguishes the employee from the self-employed person. Because the employee would, by definition, by design, receive supervision and instructions from the employer, where technically the self-employed person would be free to determine the way the work is done. But now it becomes complex because also self-employed workers may be given instructions, right, by the end user regarding the end result of the work that is assigned to them. But these instructions may not be so extensive that it can be considered as supervision over the worker. But that's really a gray area. And I think in all countries, it causes headaches for persons that need to talk and discuss this. And even courts have very different opinions sometimes about worker classification. As said, self-employed persons often work for user companies themselves, but sometimes also through intermediaries. In that case, practice shows that both the user company and the intermediate company may be at risk of being requalified as employer of the worker. Both parties should be aware of this requalification risk. I will talk later about some contractual arrangements that can be made to at least mitigate the risk a little bit. The more involved an intermediary is in the performance of the agreement between a self-employment person and a user company, for example, facilitating invoicing, payments, hour registration, absences, etc., the higher the chances are that the intermediary might be requalified as an employer of the worker. The intermediary can then be considered to be a regular employer, but can also be qualified as a temporary work agency or even as a payrolling agency. It doesn't matter that the worker is self-employed, because in this scenario, the worker is requalified as an employee because the employee met the 3 criteria that I just mentioned. Case law shows that self-employed persons can be considered assigned by an agency to a user company as well. The regulation regarding agency work must be applied in that specific situation. So back to you, Daniel.
Okay, so that, yeah, no, it made sense. I'm just going to throw in something here, actually. I mean, in the UK, to try and help on defining worker classification, HMRC have spent some time building out a much criticised tool, check employment status for tax tool, which you, as lawyers, would probably say that was always doomed to fail, given that law is always a rather grey area when you try and get some specifics around it. But I just wonder, before we move across to Thierry, if there is any sort of formal construct like that within the Netherlands, or is it the case that ultimately you don't know what the classification of a worker will be until the court's made a ruling on it? Is that the case?
Yeah, that's the situation. Of course, legislation is now put in place, or at least proposals, to get more certainty around that. But to date, the court will have the final say about requalification as such.
Yeah, which I think is probably typical. So yeah, great, Thierry. It'd be great to get your view from a Belgian perspective on this thorny topic.
Yes, in Belgium, we also have the problem of false self-employment, like in the Netherlands, in the UK, elsewhere in the world. In Belgium, it's mainly, the assessment is done mainly on 4 criteria. The first one is the will of the parties. Second, freedom to organize their work. Third, freedom to organize their working time. And then 4, the existence of a link of subordination, instructions that are given. And in fact, a court will first have to look at the agreement signed. Is it an employment contract or is it a service agreement? If it's a service agreement, it's fine, except if the execution of the agreement goes against the clauses of the service agreement. And that's where a court would then typically look at how the work is organized. Is the person free to determine the working times? Does he or she receive instructions? So these are the general rules. In some sectors, industry sectors, there is a presumption that has been created, typically in the transport sector. Another sector, for example, is in the construction sector. And then more recently, in Belgium, we have an act on platform workers. We will talk a bit later about the Platform Workers Directive that also exists now since a couple of weeks. But in Belgium, we have that act already since 1 year. So based on 8 criteria, platform workers can be considered as employees, typically if, for example, the platform will determine if there will be an exclusivity, or if the platform worker will not be able to determine his or her price, typically if he cannot refuse a job, etc. So if you have a kind of agency working with the platform to provide work to freelancers, self-employed in Belgium, you need to be careful already since a year now. So there is in general, Daniel, the rules in Belgium.
No, I think you make a great point there as well, Thierry, which is definitely a good advice cross-border, which is worker classification piece is not just purely staring at a contract. It's actually much more about working practices, isn't it? And what's actually happening on the ground. And it's both parts of that need to be considered, not just what it says on paper, what is actually happening in practice. So no, super useful. Okay, so there's obviously some common themes, I think, that we've got flowing through the legislation in all countries, but clearly important that we're aware of some of the differences to make sure that the appropriate checks and processes are being carried out. So it'd be good to sort of get some practical tips or suggestions from you both in how our audience today can avoid making a worker misclassification mistake. So Jorgo, for you first to respond.
Yes, thank you, Daniel. So yeah, as you said, it's all about substance over form. So listeners to this webinar can, start with making sure that in reality, a self-employed person actually acts as a self-employed person and doesn't receive too many instructions or supervision from the end user or the intermediary, although that's quite difficult, I guess, sometimes in practice to actually manage that. So that's one. And it's important because the political sentiment here in the Netherlands is focused on limiting working with self-employed persons. Although we have over 1 million here, the government really wants to make sure that as much as possible, workers work in an employment relationship rather than anything else. So the political climate is really against self-employed persons and against assigning them as non-employees. So that's one. So it's an uphill battle, so to speak. On the other hand, it's still desirable by a lot of end users to work with self-employed persons. It remains popular, and it's still possible in the Netherlands. So no mistake about that. The requalification risk can be managed to a certain extent, and what I mean is the financial consequences of that can be managed in the contractual sphere, where, for example, the user company would include an indemnification in the agreement with the intermediary or with the self-employed person directly, to mitigate the financial risk and to try to allocate the financial penalties to someone else than the user company. The intermediary on its term can include an indemnification in the agreement with the self-employed person, but also to a certain extent only. For example, employer contributions that are due upon requalification to Social Security cannot be reclaimed from the worker under an indemnification. Last but not least, it's advisable to assess upfront, as I just said, whether the person you work with as an intermediary or as a user company can really be considered self-employed or not. And maybe just a few tips that hopefully most people are known with is, how do you assess a self-employed person? Look at the Chamber of Commerce, of course, because a genuine self-employed person would be registered over there as an entrepreneur. Invoices would include VAT, would typically be an element that it's a self-employed situation. Clearly define results with the self-employed person rather than how the work is actually done, because that should be in the discretion of the self-employed person. As I said before, it's important to make sure in the contract that it's clearly laid down that the self-employed person has a freedom to work, has a freedom to accomplish a certain results, and that supervision on how the work actually is done should be limited as much as possible. The instructions, we already talked about that. And sometimes it's also really important to make sure that the self-employed person isn't using all sorts of company equipment, company email addresses, laptop, phones, etc. These are all indications that a certain self-employed person is actually embedded in the end user organization, and that's a strong indication that it's an employee rather than something else. And the embedding part is really becoming more and more relevant in case law as some sort of indication that it's not a self-employed situation. The government is also working on this, as I said before, in producing bills that would also link and trigger on the embedding part of things. So it's really, I think, as a final word on this, important to try to separate the self-employed person as much as possible from the core activities that are happening within the company itself.
Yeah, no, okay, definitely makes sense. We often in the UK talk about not a good idea to invite contractors to the Christmas party, for example. So I'm sure it's the same for Christmas parties in the Netherlands and Belgium as well. But yeah, to you, Thierry, for your view on the same question, please.
Yeah, no, thank you, Daniel. Yes, same here in Belgium, and the same tips as in the Netherlands would apply in Belgium. First, look at the agreement. The agreement should contain the necessary clauses typically you can say that the manco of the self-employed worker would be liable in case of reclassification. Other clauses to say, for example, that the self-employed worker can work for other clients or should work for other clients. At some clients, we even advise to say to draft the contract for 80% of the time, and to say for the 20 other percent you need to find some other clients. So not ask reports to the self-employed worker, not oblige him to attend meetings, for example. Jorgo talked about the chart and the phone list. Try to avoid that. So really consider him as an external party. Again, in Belgium, we have a lot of self-employed workers. The main reason is that the social security charges for employees are very high. If you pay 100 gross to an employee, you have to pay 27% additional social security charges as an employer. And from the 100, 13% is deducted for the employees' social security contributions. And so to avoid that, a lot of people work as self-employed or via their manco. It's even so that when people have high remuneration, they would even refuse to step on board if they are not allowed to work as a self-employed worker. So it's in the war for talent, it's important that you provide that kind of measure, or that you accept as a business to work with self-employed workers.
Yeah, so again.
Yes, no, and just a last note. I mean, case law in general would rather be in favor of the user. It's quite challenging. Again, it is accepted in Belgium by the trade unions, by the administration. We need the self-employed workers, and case law is even rather in favor of the user. It's rather challenging for a self-employed worker to ask for the reclassification in front of a court and to gain that. Yeah.
Yeah, no, completely. I think, and that's really hitting the crux of this. We're talking today a lot about the legal risk, but of course there's big commercial considerations here, isn't there, in understanding what the costs are and the reason why the businesses are looking more and more to contingent workforce, because it's actually quite an attractive way for citizens to want to work as well. So it's probably an element of the courts and the governments catching up with the spirit, but that's also in the backdrop of some pretty large pension deficits across most European countries as well. So there's a whole host of different political factors impacting this. Anyway, we'll try and stay away from the politics for a little while. But Charles, it would be great to bring you in here, please, just for you to talk us through what you see from your clients and typical behaviours on classification.
Yeah, it's an interesting point, because if you do go back, maybe 5 years, certainly 10 years, then self-employed definitely seemed to be the main way of working for contractors across most of Europe. But we've definitely seen more and more governments bringing in legislation to move temporary workers into an employed option. And of course, like the guys have mentioned, the reason behind that is that the government collects higher levels of tax and social security, so that they're generating greater revenues for themselves by having people within that structure. I think over here in the UK, obviously, as you mentioned, we've got the IR35 legislation, and there's an IR35 test that was established to show how someone could be engaged. And what we really did was use that as almost like a baseline, and then looked at other countries like the Netherlands and like Germany, where you have the AUG legislation, and we've kind of brought all of that together to produce kind of like an international version of an IR35 test. Now, this certainly isn't a legally binding document, but it gives a really good guide as to if someone should be engaged as a freelancer or via an employment model. So we're really just trying to put an extra layer of due diligence into assessing how to engage a temporary worker. And then it really just shows that someone's actually following a process. You know, they're not just making a decision around what's the cheapest option here. Let's actually look at the reality of the engagement and then make a decision based on the way that this resource is actually going to be engaged. We just feel that's probably a much better way to look at classifying your workers.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. In the absence of imagine how good it would be or how tricky it would be to have an international version of DBA, VBA or IR35. But if businesses can use some form of process to show the process that they went through to assess status and keep those records. I'm sure that would certainly help in playing well if there ever was a worker classification claim made. At least they could show some form of due diligence going through that process. So I think that's a sensible idea. So now I think let's move on now from classification and move on through the agenda and to look at ways in which workers can be engaged and the sort of different types of suppliers who can provide those different types of workers. So if I can start with you, please, Charles. Can you tell us a little bit more about the services that are provided by EOR and AOR companies like Giant Global and how they can help clients to engage workers?
Yeah, for sure. So I think we kind of touched on an EOR or employer of record service is the employed option. You know, the worker will have an employment contract. It could be open-ended, it might be a fixed term contract, but each month there'll actually be a payroll run. The worker would receive a net pay along with a pay slip. All taxes would be deducted at source, all employer costs would be paid direct to the local authorities. And the worker is then just really able to focus on the work that they're doing without having to worry about any admin associated with getting paid. Then with the AOR service or agent of record service, this is where the worker is operating as self-employed or via a limited company. And with this solution, they would be receiving what we'd call a gross payment. And then it would be part of their responsibilities to pay their taxes and social securities directly to the authorities. So there's a little bit more for the individual to do with that type of service.
Yeah, okay. So it'd be interesting, just to explore that a bit further then, Charles, in the AOR respect of these other forms of engagement. You just highlight the different potential non-employed forms of engagement.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, what we try to do is to use kind of EOR and AOR as a kind of a catch-all for the different types of terminology and structures that are out there. But I think, like the guys have mentioned earlier in the webinar, you know, you could have company to company structure, a BVBA, a BV, a sole trader, a ZZP. There are lots of different types of classifications in different countries. But from our point of view, essentially, if you are working as an independent contractor through a structure, that's what we would look at as an AOR type solution, where an agent of record is engaging with you as an individual. But then you have the EOR where that employment contract is in place. And then you can have people who are actually directly sourced or subcontracted or through consultancy agreements. So there is a real range of ways that someone can be engaged in different structures that are out there. And I guess where we assist is to look at those different structures and help to assess to make sure that they are compliant. Because ultimately, I think the area of worry is that if you engage a resource in a non-compliant way, what that could then mean for you, like you touched on yourself earlier, from a commercial viewpoint.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is where we start to touch on themes of supply chain compliance, as well as, you know, the intricacies of worker classification. So thanks for the summary. I think that was really useful. It'd be good now to go back to you, Thierry, and then to Jorgo, just to get views on the different engagement types within your specific countries. So Thierry, please, if you could kick that off for Belgium.
Yes, Daniel. And so, as I said, freelancers, mancos are often used in Belgium. I'm talking here mainly about white-collar employees or high-skilled workers. Typically, so freelancers, contractors are still often used in Belgium for the reasons that I explained. Another model is that you would have your expert or consultants on your payroll and then putting them on client sides. And this in Belgium is possible because, as I said, you can foresee in the commercial agreement that some operational limited instructions are given by the user to the employees of the provider. So this is a model that limited instructions are given to the employees of the provider. And then employer of record is another model that we see more and more. often used, for example, when a business wants to start in Belgium and hire the first employees and not roll out the payroll themselves. But so, as I said, employers of records in Belgium, there is a legal solution to work via an employer record or PEO. So this is something we see more and more as well. As I said, the temporary agency workers, of course, we see them a lot, but again, more blue collar workers typically, and in certain sectors. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's probably also an echo of some of the behaviours that we see where a white collar professional contractor would not necessarily want to be viewed as a temporary worker. So there can also be some ego going in and around this arrangement, because it very much is, employer of record for blue collar versus white collar. But if we're to head in this direction of compliance, which is for people to be employed and engaged, then hey, if you're on €1,000 a day, I don't think we need to worry too much about being talked about as a temporary worker, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And even if the temporary agency worker has a contract with the agency, the contract with the client, with the user, is a weekly contract. So yeah, that can stop immediately. So as you say, there's a kind of reputational risk there for the employee, or he could be moved from one project to another very quickly. So yes, as I said, it's more for blue collar workers and different sectors. Yeah.
Understood. Great. And Jorgo, back to you.
Yeah, so thank you very much. So in terms of the EOR, we would technically probably list that as the payrolling construct that I just explained, or it could also be agency work. So that's EOR. AOR, which is of course not a legal term, legally would probably translate to what we would say, tussenkomst, intermediate. Actually assigning a self-employed person. So all the models that you just talked about, and also Tsiris, consultancy, freelance, EOR, AOR, these are all non-legal words and models, and we as lawyers always try to put them in one of the boxes. And in the Netherlands, it's just only 3 boxes. It's either payrolling, that's 1. 2, it's temporary work agency, or it's work as a self-employed person. So from a legal perspective, it can only be one of those 3 boxes. But in the practice, a lot of other words and models are being used. And these are the same in the Netherlands as in Belgium, and even in the UK.
Yeah, okay, good. Well, we're moving on now to sort of the final section of the webinar. So just as a reminder to everyone, if you've got any particular questions you want to ask, please do throw them into the Q&A, and we'll try and get round to some of those at the end of the session. But now let's move on then to discuss the responsibilities and compliance requirements that are in place in both Belgium and Netherlands for the types of providers of workers. So what I mean by that specifically is businesses like recruitment businesses or payroll providers, or even recruitment platforms, which we've mentioned earlier. These are all ways that businesses, end users, can access talent and receive supply of workers. So Thierry, if you could please cover Belgium first and talk us through the compliance requirements for providers of temporary workers.
Yes, in Belgium, you have 2 kinds of licenses. You don't need a license to provide freelancers to an end user, typically, unlike in other countries, I think. The 2 types of licenses we have, one is for permanent staffing. So really what I call the headhunting activity, when you put candidates, employees in contact with future employers. In Belgium, we have 3 regions. In the Flanders, in the north of the country, you don't need a license. But in Brussels and in the Walloon region, it's a bit old-fashioned, but you need a kind of registration. It's not a lot of work. It's online, can be done quite quickly, but you need to be registered and then to have a kind of number that you need to provide on your invoices and letterheads. So that's for the permanent staffing. Another license we have is for the temporary agency workers. So this is strictly regulated, and there you need, in the 3 regions, you need to have a license if your clients are in that region. Again, it's a kind of online application. It's a bit more work, a bit more burdensome. But apart from that, so if you don't do temporary agency work in Belgium and that you don't do really the permanent staffing, but that you have your employees on client side or freelancer that you put on client sides, you don't need a line. So there is no specific compliance.
No, great, understood. And yeah, just to add a little more complexity, in Belgium, where you're having to look at different regional approaches as opposed to just by country, right? Meryl, great to bring you in here, and thanks for participating today. It'd be good for you to pick up the same position from a Netherlands perspective, please.
Yeah, thank you. Good to be here today. Well, actually, in the Netherlands, there's extensive regulation on the type of work we are discussing today. So when hiring workers from user companies like a temporary work agency, it is important to make sure the agency is registered in the Dutch Trade Register with their activity of providing workers. So it is forbidden to hire workers as a user company from an agency without such a registration. And a fine can be imposed if you nevertheless do so. So that is at first an important thing to keep in mind. Secondly, user companies can be held liable for payments of wages and taxes and social security premiums over the wages of workers of these agencies when the agency does not pay these taxes and wages and premiums. So for user companies, it's therefore useful to check whether the agency they are hiring from is registered in the SNA register. So this is a register from the organization called SNA. This organization checks whether agencies fulfill their legal obligations. So it's advisable to check whether the agency you hire from has this registration, but also to obtain this SNA registration as an agency, because it makes you a trusted partner for user companies. Furthermore, user companies, they can be exempted from this liability by paying to a special bank account from agencies, which is called the G account. Some of you might be familiar with it. It's an agency, it's an account you can pay to, and if the agency then also has the registration I just talked about, the SNA registration, and complies to some additional administrative requirements, then you could be exempted from the liability as a user company. And then, of course, there are a lot of equal treatment provisions applicable to employees of agencies, and these are mostly focused on equal pay. So temporary agency workers are entitled to the same salary as employees of the user company that perform the same work. And they also fall under the scope of industry-wide collective labor agreements and a pension fund. And the same applies to payroll employees, but actually to a further extent. So they are entitled to all employment conditions of employees of the user company that perform this comparable work, actually. And they might be entitled to pension if the employees of the user company are entitled to pension. And also their dismissal protection is more strict. So they will, when the payrolling agency wishes to dismiss a payrolling employee, these employees will be, their dismissal will be assessed as if they are employees of the user company. So it's very strict, and they are treated very comparable to employees of the user company.
Yeah, thanks, Meryl. Definitely resonating there, some of the agency worker regulation piece you were talking about, I think, around making sure that contingent or temporary workers are paid the same as a comparable employee. That's certainly something that we're familiar with in the UK as well. Even though we are technically outside of Europe now, we still apply that legislation. So thanks, Meryl. And Charles, if you could give Giant Global operate, you obviously operate in a wide range of different countries, then it's obviously a lot going on there. It must be quite challenging for you to manage adherence to all these different laws and rules. So can you tell us quickly about how you and other global payroll providers would try and address that complexity?
Yeah, for sure. Definitely challenging. So we have our internal team who are experienced in international payroll solutions. We also have our proprietary software that allows us to deliver our services globally. but we work with a network of specialists like Osborne Clarke. You know, they are based locally in each country in which we operate. They're able to feed back information to our team, so that when things are changing, we can then formulate how we need to develop or adapt our solutions to make sure that they are staying compliant for our clients. So I would say this is definitely one of the key aspects of being able to operate in as many countries as we do. We have to have our trusted partner network of companies like Osborne Clarke.
There we go. Shameless plug for Thierry, Jorgo and Merrill services there. So I think, just conscious of time, so if we could just quickly move through the final section here. I suppose we've covered a lot of ground today. So I think just final word now for Thierry and Merrill, if there are any other particular legislative changes that are upcoming that you want to flag to the audience, and then we'll move on to Q&A.
Yes, thank you, Daniel. I think I would like to flag two pieces of legislation on European level. So this is not specific to Belgium. The first one is the Platform Workers Directive that you have followed of the last couple of weeks. So there is now a Platform Workers Directive. But unlike the first draft of the directive that France didn't like, there are no criteria built in the Platform Workers Directive. So it will be the member states who will in the 2 coming years have to work on to create a presumption of employment relationship for the platform workers. And as I said, we have that in Belgium since 1 year. Not a lot of case law yet, so it hasn't changed much for the time being. But your businesses should be prepared if you work with platforms providing work to freelancers, or to change your model, to be very cautious, to look at what will happen in the member states, perhaps providing another model, an employment model to be seen. But so we advise clients on this for the time being. And then a second piece of legislation, and I'm not a finance specialist, but it's the European legislation around payments. So you have the Payment Services Directive, PSD3. You have the Payment Services Regulation, PSR, Financial Data Access, the FIDA. And so from what I read, I think the main observation here is to say that today, when you are, for example, an MSP and that you collect payments at the user to pay subcontractors, you should not always be registered as a kind of payment intermediary, because you can play on a kind of exception, which is a commercial agent exception. That will change, and you will probably have to change your model. So you have to look at it again, seek for legal advice. I'm not a specialist, but these are changes coming in the payment environment, so to say.
No, fantastic. Thanks for pointing that out, Thierry. And then Merrill, over to you for the final word on any of the legislation for the guys.
Yes, thank you. So in the Netherlands, there are some legislative changes coming up, which should be kept an eye on. So there is a bill pending regarding the admission of companies providing workers on the labor market to user companies. So, for example, a temporary work agency. And if the bill gets adopted, the companies must have an admission. They must be admitted by the minister to provide workers. And to obtain the admission, they must, to shortly say, they must prove compliance with labor laws, with social security laws, fiscal laws, and they must prove their financial security and have a declaration of good behavior, which will also be issued by the government, by the minister. So the platform directive, I can limit myself to saying we do not have legislation on platform work in the Netherlands already. So we are expecting a bill coming up for this presumption. And then last but not least, there has been very critical EU case law from the EU Court of Justice regarding the temporariness of temporary agency work. And in the Netherlands, this is now possible for an indefinite term to work for the same user company. And we are also expecting legislation in this regard to the temporariness.
That's great. No, thanks, Merrill, for flagging. So thanks to everybody for sharing your insight. I think it's really clear that there are obviously definite differences between the countries and also some similarities. But what is also a definitive everywhere is that the legislation is a continual moving feast. So I think it would be, from my perspective, I'd certainly recommend anyone who's engaging with a way of sourcing workers should make sure that there's a variety of different options available there to make sure that they can address all those different worker groups. I think back in the day, as Charles would say, it used to be the case that global payroll was all about making Manco type payments or PSE payments, but it now, given the direction of travel, you can't avoid the necessary need to adhere to this employment legislation as well. So thank you, everybody. As promised, I think we've got just a couple more minutes where we'll dip into some questions. And by the way, any that we don't answer today, happy to, we'll follow up with the guys and we'll get some returns on email to any questions we don't get to now. But just sort of picking through these, there's one in here for you, Charles. With the assessment that you mentioned, that you complete on worker classification, who completes that? Would you ask questions for both the client and the contractor, or what's the process there?
Sure. So generally speaking, it's the hiring manager. What we're looking to try and find out with that questionnaire is what is the reality of the way that individual is being engaged. So it really normally is the hiring manager who actually has that visibility to know, is this individual going to be sitting at a desk with a whole bunch of employees doing the same job? Are they going to be invited to the office Christmas party and all the other things that we've mentioned throughout? So it's someone who's actually got that visibility of how the engagement is going to happen. So that could be a recruiter. They might have that ability to see that, or it might be they need to engage with the end client as well to really assess with them in combination how that resource is going to be used.
Yeah, I think if you can get the opinion from the end hirer and a senior person at the end hirer, that's always going to be useful, as well as taking a steer from the recruiter, but maybe a bit nervous just to take the recruiter's view on it. Question from Gary. Hi, Gary. Specifically around Netherlands, I think we've heard the term broker deal in the Netherlands, but found limited information on this. Could you explain how this broker deal might be different from the engagement of a self-employed worker via an agency to a user company? So I don't know, Meryl or Jorgo, if you're comfortable answering that question. It's specifically around the term broker deal that's been referred to in the Netherlands. Does that resonate with you as a phrase?
Well, we've had a short discussion on it, but the broker deal, if it could be maybe made a bit more explicit, but for us, it does not really ring a bell now, unfortunately.
Okay, no problem. Well, I can get some further clarification on that,
Yeah.
and perhaps we can put it into the follow-up there, so that's not a problem. And then, yeah, I think a few asking for, Catherine asking if we could share detail for the link for the license arrangements for permanent staffing. So I think we can certainly look into that for both Belgium and Netherlands and share that on the follow-up that we send out. I'm conscious of time. We're coming up to the hour now, so I think we should take the time to wrap up. Thank you, everybody, for taking the time to join today. I thought it was super interesting and really appreciate the insight from Meryl, Jorgo, and Thierry and Charles. Thank you to everybody. We'll obviously continue these series of webinars from Giant on topics, so please do keep an eye out for the next session that I'm running. And for the rest of the day, I hope you enjoy, and we'll see you again soon. Thank you, everybody.
Bye.
Cheers.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Thank you. Bye.
Great thing.